Good evening, dear audience, here at the St. Stephen's Praish Hall in Princeton, Trinidad and Tobago, as well as those of you who are logged into our live stream on the UWI YouTube channel, that is the Universal Movement for the Reconstruction of Black Identity channel. This is a special day for us, a very important day. Why is it important? Today marks the recommencement of a series of lectures that the Universal Movement for the Reconstruction of Black Identity engaged in prior to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which caused all of us, including you, to suspend a number of activities which we take for granted. We in UWI are pleased to begin the process again, a very important process where we are seeking what we refer to as reparative justice. We are seeking reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans. It's a topic that is so important that in 2013, the heads of government of the Caribbean community took a decision calling for reparations for native genocide, the descendants of the first people, and very importantly, reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans. The Universal Movement for the Reconstruction of Black Identity, as a responsible civil society organization, is of the view that this discussion should not only be generated, should not only be left to governments of the Caribbean region to engage in. We believe that civil society is suitably placed to engage in the communities, in the cities, in the boroughs, in the villages, on the streets of Trinidad and Tobago, and wherever in the Caribbean people are joining our call for reparative justice, reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans. The time is not late, notwithstanding the fact that slavery was abolished in 1834 and the vestiges of that slavery ended physically in 1838, but the mental element continued after that. From then to now, there has been a call for reparations. That call has not been heeded. Until a few years ago, we have witnessed institutions in the United States and Europe, including academic institutions, which have now recognized the importance of engaging in reparative justice. We are very pleased in UWI to have our chairman, Professor Emeritus of the University of the West Indies, Dr. Winston, leading our charge on behalf of our organization in the quest for reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans. Professor Sweet is not new to the audience of Trinidad and Tobago. He has had a most distinguished career both in his chosen profession as an engineer and as a social and a political activist. Let me give you a summary of the man, Winston Sweet, who I'm talking about. Professor Sweet is a graduate of the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica, in the early 1960s, where he read for his BSc special degree in physics. He's also a graduate of the University of the West Indies, St Augustine campus, Trinidad and Tobago, where he obtained his BSc, Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering, his Doctor of Philosophy, his PhD in Civil Engineering, and his MSc in Project Management and Engineering. Dr. Sweet is now Professor Emeritus of the University of the West Indies, a distinguished title bestowed on professors who are globally renowned for their work and who have retired from full-time lectureship. Currently, Professor Sweet is a senior research fellow and professor of the University of Trinidad and Tobago. As I intimated earlier on, Professor Sweet is not only the chairman, but the founding chairman of the Universal Movement for the Reconstruction of Black Identity since 1969. He's an activist, he's a researcher, he's a prolific writer on matters relating to black power and the importance of restorative justice to the descendants of not only enslaved Africans, but people who are downtrodden. You may recall his important involvement in the 1970 People's Rebellion. As a person who loves to give back to the society, Professor Sweet is also a former chairman of the Airports Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, a member of the board of the National Quarries, chairman of the Public Transport Service Corporation of Trinidad and Tobago, chairman of NITCO, chairman of the National Trust of Trinidad and Tobago, where he has done some important work in recognizing the historical importance of certain archives of Trinidad and Tobago, including important public buildings and so on. He was a member of the Procurement Appeals of Trinidad and Tobago, president of the Association of Professional Engineers, chairman of the Infrastructure Committee of the Vision 2020, which was a vision that established by the late Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Patrick Manning. He has been recognized in Trinidad and Tobago and beyond for his work. He has received the award for excellence of a career in engineering by the Association of Professional Engineers of Trinidad and Tobago, and he's a fellow of several engineering bodies within the Caribbean region and globally. I think it's an honor for me as chair of the proceedings to welcome Professor Sweet to resume this important task of the debate for reparations for the descendants of African slaves and enslaved Africans. And we are hopeful that our plea, our lectures, will not fall on deaf ears. I give you Professor Winston Sweet.
I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, although I'm not seeing any ladies, but I'm sure they are listening in on the site. Let me say for the records a little bit about myself, although I do not want my presentation to be autobiographical. I grew up not too far from here on the North Road, and I attended St. Stephen's Primary School not too far from here, where my mother and father before had attended. And in fact, I grew up on the corner there that some people call the Sweets Corner, because my great-great-grandfather was the sexton of the Anglican Church way back in it would have been 60s, because the deed for the piece of land that he bought from the church goes back to 1869. So he would have been a product of the immediate emancipation and an early member of the Anglican Church and Anglican community in Princestown. My second job, I have to say second, because my first job was to work as a trainee operator in Texaco, was in fact as a teacher in St. Stephen's College, where I worked for the better part of an academic year and a half. And so my roots are both residential and employment-wise. So that is for those of you who are not familiar with where I come from, and that adds to the presentation by my good friend Eden, attempting to present abbreviated CV of my activity. What I would like to do is, I would like to start off by saying how proud I am, how happy I am to be able to come back to Princestown, where I spent most of my early life. And who knows, I might be interred somewhere around in the vicinity of this compound when my time is up. My mother lies somewhere just beyond that wall, and my father lies, and his mother across the road on the other side. So who knows, I might end up here spending my last hours with the worms. I have always considered my home as Princestown. I'm not apologizing for that. One can actually say that even at my elderly age, from time to time I dream of my youth. I dream of when I was a boy running around in the cocoa estates around there and going to school, almost as if I'm transported back 70 or more years back. That is the joy of living long. Now, let us get into the topic. First, I will start off by saying I brought a number of books that I consider important in my own personal development, and which I believe that anybody who's interested in the question of reparation or the issue of the African diaspora or the descendants of the enslaved Africans in the New World should have in his cupboard of books. I have first a text by our first Prime Minister. It is Capitalism and Slavery. Very interesting, because Williams, in this book, which was the publication of his DPhil or his doctorate, postulated that the Industrial Revolution in Europe, mainly France and England, was financed by Caribbean slavery. I go one step further to say that the Industrial Revolution, which the slave emancipation produced in Europe, was the cause of the entire global development of capitalism and the present economic system as we see it today. In fact, the Industrial Revolution taking place in Europe was responsible for the development of human civilization, not only within Europe, but even in the ex-colonies. And I said this is a must-have. A must-have. Another must-have is a book written by one of my youthful colleagues. We were students together in Mona. He would have been about 2 years or a year ahead of me. A young fella, very bright. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. Underdeveloped. In other words, this is important, because the question of development in Africa is still being debated. And I'll come back to that. But what he did is something that I was pointing out just to my wife about an hour or so ago, is that there was a deliberate move to underdevelop, to make up a word, to disdevelop the African continent. This is a must-have. A must-have. It is compulsory reading for many people in the United States and in the United Kingdom, in Europe. The other book I want to point out, another must-have, is a book written by another distinguished Trinidadian scholar and national hero, the Black Jacobins, written the same year when Williams was submitting his thesis. James published his book, Black Jacobins, another milestone in our history. Why a milestone? Because many of us who used to live in the cinema and even do some reading, we heard about Roman times and Spartacus, the famed Spartacus. one of the famed slave rebellions that unfortunately it was not successful. Whereas the Black Jacobins of Haiti was the first successful slave rebellion in the annals of Homo sapiens. In fact, I was in England a few months ago where I saw a young Indian scholar has taken pen to paper to rewrite the history. I bought it, I haven't gotten time around to read it. To rewrite that experience. And that experience is important for us because of the brutality that America, France, Europe, etc. brought down on the Haitian people, that up to now the Haitian people cannot see their way. And I will mention Haiti again in the context of this lecture, the question of reparation. There's another book, it's one of many written by another scholar and activist in our history who raised the issue not only of reparation but repatriation, a word that a lot of people confuse educated people. Repatriation is about returning to the fatherland. It is about the movement of ex-slaves wanting to go back to the fatherland. The Garveyite movement was, in fact, has emerged the most pronounced and successful effort to repatriate African descendants back to the mother country. There's a large colony of Africans not only in Sierra Leone and Ethiopia, but we are familiar with the Rastafarian movement, who have literally taken Garvey's initiation into the present century. I believe that a number of books have been written on the role of Marcus Garvey. Let me tell you a little secret. When we formed our organization in 1969, one of the what we call ideological heroes of our movement, Umobi, was Marcus Garvey. In fact, the Garvey movement, it is manipulating the name of the Garveyite movement that gave us the prefixes to form Umobi. I was to follow, when I did some studying at the time, that the Garveyite movement, the largest Garveyite branches, number of branches, was in Trinidad after Jamaica and America. Trinidad had the largest number of branches of the Garveyite movement. I want to introduce my talk about, I want to begin on that. The next thing I want to talk briefly is about a book recently published that has caused a lot of confusion on the American continent and in Europe too. It's called the 1619 Project. It is an attempt to document the experiences of a lot of people at that time, 1619, which the Americans see as the start of enslavement of the African in America. Now, we should point out, for those who may not remember, that the experience of the enslavement of the descendants or Africans in the Caribbean started more than 100 years, in fact 115 years before that. And where do I get that data? I got that data from the very Catholic Church. the Catholic Church, their scholarly group, who raised this question of reparation in the last 5 years and has agreed to put aside something like $3 or $5 million to compensate some of these families who have suffered from them. The Jesuits, this is the scholars of the Catholic Church. They were critical in the last, just after COVID broke out. They pointed out that Columbus on his very first voyage had Africans. When we were younger, we would like to tell ourselves that these were sailors. They were not sailors. They were African slaves on the very first voyage. And therefore the Jesuits begin the period of enslavement of the African in the New World in 1501. 1501. And some of us remember this fellow got the special title Apostle of the Indian. He too must come on for high condemnation, because when he found that the enslavement of the indigenous people was cruel and barbaric, he recommended that the colony that they were setting up in Santo Domingo, etc., that they should use Africans who are better suited to the hard work and the temperature, climate. So it's important for us to have the milestone that we in the Caribbean here have to look at 1501 as the start date, official start date by the Jesuits. Although Columbus had slaves on his first voyage in 1492. We have to get some of these things. Now, I'm telling you this because I had decided quite early that at this point, I'm going to give a series of lectures over the country on this issue. But that a lot of problems are arising in, as they say, how they say it in Star Trek, I forget the word right now. They're in the medium. The word will come back to me. In other words, there's a lot of confusion, and something told me, Winston, do not give a lecture. Yes, people need to get clarity and grounding in certain bits of information, but don't give a lecture. Begin with attempting to deal with some of the difficult problems, what I call the controversial issues that have arisen in the last 5 years in the environment as people have started to discuss reparation. People asking all kinds of foolishness, which from time to time I have to spend my time on the cell phone, on chat sites, explaining this and explaining that. I am going to deal with that first. And whatever time remains, I will tell you all something else about what we are doing in respect of the struggle. For instance, is not about forgiveness. Because a lot of people often ask us as if we are priests, or we want to convert somebody, or we want to go to heaven, and therefore we want to talk about forgiveness. Reparation is not about forgiveness. That is not our business. Other people talk about reparation, and they want to know whether you forgive the white people, you forgive the... I am not dealing with that here. Reparation is about repairing, fixing, making good. In fact, reparation comes very close to our area of the law where we talk about damages, where you injure somebody and you have to compensate. You have to try to put them back as close as possible to where they were before this act was committed, or had the act not been committed. Reparation, we have to keep in mind, is about making good. And therefore, if we talk about making good, we have to talk about the making bad. We have to talk about what I call the crime of the millennia. And some people may want to challenge me. I enjoy those things, particularly at my age. The question of who and what and how much. The question is, as I was telling my wife, often we look at the great enslavement, what I call the third enslavement. And I'm saying this on this platform today because I'm going to deal with it in more detail. The African who was first enslaved not by the Europeans in 1501. The Africans were first enslaved by the Arabs. The Arabs were the first to enslave the African. In 642, immediately after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And many people consider this unfortunate. Unfortunate why? Because in the early days before Islam had in fact been the dominant religion in the Arabian Peninsula, and they were, as it were, on the run. A party of Muslims in the embryonic stage had to flee Mecca. And they were given succor, land on which to build their homes, to develop. They brought their wives, and to set up a community in Ethiopia. This is why some people say that Islam first settled in Ethiopia, because that is where they went first when they were literally in danger in their own country. In fact, even today, in Ethiopia, there are three dominant religions. The Ethiopian Coptic religion, Judaism, and Islam. But be that as it may, I wanted to put that on the table, that our first enslavement began in 642, soon after the Prophet died. Race forward. Slavery under the hands of the Muslim invasion from Saudi Arabia, from Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula. We had many years after, that is 1440. Again, this is well documented, that the first Europeans to begin the enslavement of Africans took place in 1440, almost 1,000 years after. And the enslaved Africans were taken to Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula. And some records point out that soon more than 20% of the population of what is called Portugal consisted of black people. That's the first place they seized Africans and brought them as workers in their field and in their houses in Portugal from 1440. This is why many people consider Portugal the blackest of the European countries, and that most of even our famous footballer who got in noise with Manchester United last week. Ronaldo, people say that all of them are mulattoes. Well, that's a long story. I wouldn't go into that at this point. But that is the second great enslavement of the African. And most of us are familiar with what is considered as the great enslavement. The enslavement that took place post-Columbus. Columbus started it in 1501 under the blessing of the Apostle of the Indian. In other words, that is the one that we tend to focus on more than anything else, the last. What is interesting, in studying, attempting to deal with these problems, I'm not going to go much into it, but I'll point out that the records are that roughly about 20 million Africans were enslaved at the hands of the Europeans. All of them did not reach the New World. Large numbers. Some records put it at about 10, some say 15% perished in the ports of Africa and in the voyage, the transatlantic voyage. And of course, there's no direct record of those who perished in the first years of enslavement. So as I was reading, and I came across the information on the first enslavement, I found a great similarity. And I'm inviting you to check this for yourself. That coincidentally, the total number of Africans enslaved by the Arabs were roughly about the same thing, 20 million. And again, paradoxically, roughly about 10 to 15% perished on a voyage not across salt water, but across the sands of African desert. I will deal with that another time. I know it is fire because the Muslims do not talk about their period of enslavement of Africans. It's as if it never happened. It's not discussed. I want to invite any one of you who have heard any of the Muslim leaders or the African converts to Islam talking about that. I am not going to say they don't know about it. I am going to say that they don't want to talk about that. But be that as it may. Let us move on. Another important issue that troubles us is people say, this thing has happened, granted that the Europeans enslaved you, get over with, sweet, move on. Look, you went to high school, you went to university, get on. Look, so-and-so had trouble and they own this, and why don't you all move on? And they are suggesting or stating clearly that we, the descendants of Africans, must get on with it. We must get on with it and stop looking for handouts. And to these people, I say, are you aware that reparation is not a 21st century concept? One of the earliest instances of reparation being given, in fact, refers to the very Bible all of us grew up with. The more you dig, the more you find. In fact, when Cyrus the Great invaded Babylon, one of the things Cyrus is recorded as having done is to set free the Jews who were enslaved in Babylon, not Egypt. That's another thing we grow up hearing, that how the Jews were enslaved in Egypt and blah, 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 blah. And you go, I'm inviting you to go on your computer and check, and you will see that today, that the question of the enslavement of the Jews in Egypt is not a historical fact. Neither it is a historical fact that the Egyptians enslaved the Jews. These are not historical facts. They are challenged today. But all of us grew up hearing that and we recite it. And with Moses, go down Moses, let my people go, etc. The literature today is saying that there's no historical experience of any Jews being enslaved in Egypt, and that there is record of Jews being enslaved in Babylon, and Cyrus the Great setting the Jews free somewhere around 700 and something before the Common Era. In fact, Cyrus the Great did more than simply set the Jews free. Cyrus the Great gave the Jews money to rebuild the Temple of Solomon the second time. That is historical facts. I'm inviting you when you leave here to go and check that. In other words, Cyrus the Great, who did not enslave the Jews, in fact gave them reparation on behalf of the Babylonians who he had conquered. He assumed the responsibility of the debt owed to the Jews for enslaving them, and he gave them money to rebuild the second temple. So that goes back to more or less 700 years before Christ. So you see, what we're talking about is almost 3,000 years ago. That's one of the earliest cases of reparation being given to an oppressed people for a crime of enslavement. More recently, the Jews were given reparation by the Germans after the Second World War. That is documented again. Germany had to pay the rest of Europe reparation at the end of the First World War. Well documented. In other words, the First World War that ended in 1918, that war was 1914, 1918. That after 1918, the German government had to pay reparation, although they lost the war. The next case I will quote is that the German people again were called upon when they lost the Second World War, 1939, 1945, to pay the Western countries who won the war reparation. I will go back in history to point out that Toussaint Louverture and his generals, having defeated the army of Britain, France, England, and liberated Haiti as the first successful slave rebellion, were forced to pay reparation after 1803, when they officially declared themselves, and America said they will not recognize them if they do not pay reparation for the loss of the slaves to the French government. And Haiti had to continue paying reparation from 1803 up to a few years ago. In other words, I'm bringing home the point that reparation is not a modern concept. And reparation, in the case of Cyrus the Great and the Jews, went even further back than the European enslavement of the Africans. That should silence some of my friends who like to ask questions about why we are asking for reparation. Then they try to bowl some balls like the West Indies cricket team. Those seem to be able to bowl, but I can deal with them. They ask the question, who should get reparation in Trinidad? Should we give reparation to the indigenous people, the indigenous Indians? The answer is yes. And I answered that quite some time, emphatically saying yes. And what is my yardstick? Is that they were abused, brutalized, and enslaved, and therefore that gives them the right for reparation from the abuser. In fact, the indigenous people have an organization. When we resumed our work 4 years ago, we tried to make contact with them, but at that time they were way ahead of us, operating out of the Arima place. They even get Arima to be considered as the indigenous people's home. And from time to time, governments have made allocations to them, and they're better off than us in that respect. They have taken their fight ahead of us. But I want for the record that Umrobi recognizes the rights of the indigenous people who owned and occupied this land. They are entitled to reparation. The question is, who should pay them reparation? Well, the answer is simple. Those who abused them, those who enslaved them. Initially the Spanish. And they appropriated their land and put them in reservations like the American whites did to the indigenous Indians there. Took away their land, corralled them on 5 different estates in Trinidad, one in Arima, one somewhere in Sabaneta, another one in Siparia, one in Princeton. We had these that were called missions. That is how we in Princeton here end up with the term mission. We were not called mission initially because of the Canadian mission that was to come many years after, but it was a mission where they had corralled the indigenous people, fenced them in. And I'm saying the loss of their territory, the loss of their land, their rights to practice their religion, they have suffered. They have been calling for compensation or reparation for quite some time. Part of our struggle is to identify and support them. But that does not mean that we must put down our struggle and take up their struggle. What we do is we lend solidarity. We support them. We recognize their rights. And when Bartholomew, the apostle of the Indian, say, well, ease up on the indigenous people and take the African, it was unfortunate for us. But that doesn't mean I will say, well, stop paying them reparation. No. We as people who have suffered, we were elected to suffer after them, recognize their rights and support their rights. So that is my answer to them, to that question. Do the indigenous people have a right to reparation? Yes. And who should give them? First, the Spanish people, the Spanish government. And secondly, when the British took over this country, in 1797, they assumed the duty, the debt to pay the indigenous people. They never take it on. But in assuming control and ownership of the land, you assume the responsibility of the debts that were accruing to the original owner. It's still so if you go and buy a piece of land and have a problem, you have to deal with the debt. In fact, you should find out what debt he owes and decide that is part of your buying out of the new owner. And this goes on from the British during slavery, colonialism, etc. And I'll talk more about that period at the end of slavery emancipation, when I describe it as cutting and running. You know, long time the old people used to say, well, you cut and run. Well, they were so eager to cut and run, they couldn't care less. They did not, part of the discussion about independence for Trinidad and Tobago did not include the debt of reparation to the indigenous Indians. So all we can assume is that that's a debt that has to be pursued, and the debt didn't dissolve, but that when the government of Trinidad and Tobago present in the past assumed control of Trinidad and Tobago, 1962, and we had our flags and we had all these other things, we should have discussed all outstanding debts, including the debt to the indigenous people. And if you did not bargain for that and include that and press that with the British people, indirectly you are assuming the responsibility to pay that debt. The people might like you to say that, but the Trinidad government indirectly assumes the responsibility from the colonial government when they got independence of Trinidad. And that is not only in respect of the Indians. I will deal with that. That's a very serious issue. And many people like us not to talk about that. They would like us to think of the debt for the Indians just evaporated like many other debts. The next question is, people have asked, what about the Chinese and the Portuguese who came here? You see, two of them knew that the Chinese and the Portuguese were brought in Trinidad before 1842. In other words, after 1838, when so-called emancipation were being put in place, part of the strike breaking, as it were, in trade union language, they sought to bring Chinese from China and Portuguese from Portugal to settle here, to cut the cane and run the estates as the labor, because some of the Africans refused, as it were, to continue in semi-slavery as before. So their first reaction was, rather than settle with the African slaves and deal with them and their debt, which I will come back to, they decided I will bring Portuguese as contract labor. Very subtle, to deal with the Africans, bypassing, bringing competition. So the first competition brought in here in early 1840 were Portuguese and Chinese. And the Portuguese and Chinese who came to Trinidad, that experiment quickly fizzled out as a failure. Both these communities decided that, look, in local language, we ain't come out to do that. The Chinese and the Portuguese decided that they didn't like what this contract was looking like about labor in the field, and they say, no, we're not doing that. They didn't get back on a plane and go back home, or they decided to stay here and get involved, and we know them all around. They married, they have children. Both the Chinese and the Portuguese went into business. They went into business before 1842-45 when the East Indian came. A failure of the experiment with the Indians, with the Chinese and the Portuguese, was the bringing of the East Indian in 42-45. And therefore, to answer the question, the mischievous question that some people ask, what about the Chinese? I say the Chinese themselves solved the problem. First thing, they never worked much in the field, so no debt accrued. And therefore they have no, unless somebody could claim a breach of contract. But outside some breach of contract for the terms of what they were offered, both parties allowed the contract to fizzle out. And as far as I am concerned, they are not entitled to any reparation, either the Portuguese or the Chinese. I stand by that. Some people say, sweet, what about the East Indians? In fact, just recently I saw a letter where somebody was saying that, you know where I saw it? In this. I was making a copy of this. I hope you all have copies of this. This is the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparative justice. My friend Eden was talking about this. Every one of you all should have had this. And read it, because it's CARICOM's attempt, and I'll talk briefly about this. It's CARICOM's attempt to concretize the issue of reparation and put in a framework. And this is what CARICOM is tying itself to as the path forward for reparation. You may have criticisms that they should ask for more, or they should be clearer anything, but this is the document. This is what is in place that I believe that all of our people, all the descendants of Africans in Trinidad and the CARICOM region should get this document. It's not long. They say it's 10 points, but it's only about 6 sheets of paper. And familiarize. There's no memorizing. It's familiarize and give your children, make your children read it too. Somebody was saying in the document that there is no mention of reparation for indentureship. That's true. This document does not deal with reparation for indentureship. And we know what indentureship means. Indentureship means the relationship between the East Indian who came to Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, lesser to Grenada and Jamaica. They came as contract labor. Much has been written about it. My point, after my own years of studying, is that we have to separate reparation for slavery from any other reparation, any other making good. That does not mean that I question the rights of East Indians to ask for compensation. Some of you all are aware, and I was recently looking for one of my documents, but as you get old, you can't find things. There was, in fact, in our history, in your history, recent, where there were groups of Indians on estates in this vicinity, east of the highway going south, going out St. Charles, all the estates there, and north going as far as Pointe-à-Pierre. A number of the estates, I don't have the list with me. I am sure it would include Brothers Road, and those estates where I believe my great-grandfather might have been a slave on that estate. In other words, there was a demonstration of peaceful Indians marching. It's possibly the most well-known protests of East Indians on several estates, protesting the conditions of work and the general brutality. And the governor at the time, that's why we want to strike up all these fellas' names from any street, house, road, anything, because of the evil. There was a massacre that took place. Well, you might be able to help me with that. There was a massacre, which I think somewhere between 50 and 100 Indians were killed, shot. I remember a friend of mine, I see Francois is there. It's his friend who was detained with us. He's now dead. We had organized where we were going to build a monument somewhere in the Pointe-à-Pied area to commemorate that event. Because a lot of people don't know about it. Many Indians don't know about it and they don't want to talk about it. That's not their business. They don't tell their children about it. And many Africans say that is not your business. It is your business. Indians had serious problems with their contract of employment and their brutality and sometimes death whenever they protested. It wasn't milk and honey all the time. Yes, they brought them in as strike breakers and we vexed to them for that one. But all was not well with them. And therefore I am saying anybody who studies the history, anytime you mind your own business, you'll see other people's problems too. You realize that they have just cause against the colonial government for compensation that is suffered by the imposition of an unfair contract and the brutality that followed from it. Listen, at a certain time, the numbers were, I'm trying to remember, either 10 or 50% of the Indians, I could be wrong, so forgive me if I make a mistake. I remember seeing one of these records there. Of the Indians who initially came, in the Fatah al-Razak and the others, went back home. Those who stayed, they struggled. Some of them became successful, others did not. But we have to recognize, while we mind our own business, that they too have cause for protestation and had a reason to demand reparation for a bad contract and what they suffered, all the brutality that they suffered at the hands of the colonial government, both during the period of indentureship and beyond. And that is my answer. And I'm saying I am willing to support what I say with the facts. In that respect, not all the Indians agree with what I'm saying. Some of them conveniently would like to move on. But the fact is that all of them did not become millionaires. All of them would not say, move on, sweet. Some of them will say, yes, we heard from our grandparents and great-grandparents talking about the brutality and the massacre that took place because the employer had the upper hand in what looked like a contract. So that is my answer. That is my answer. That yes, we should be mindful of the rights of the East Indian to want to claim reparation. Not for enslavement, it doesn't say, but for the brutality and the one-sidedness of the contract that he was forced to enter in, and even the terms that he signed to when he reached here that were not delivered. But we, on the other hand, have to recognize the uniqueness of the African experience, the cultural brutality, where we lost language, pride in self. We still have people who describe themselves as Negroes. Negroes, that's a major cultural problem. When you call yourself a Negro, it's because you don't want to see yourself as African. And they have all kinds of arguments. Oh, they're born in Africa, not African. Last week, or this week, when the East Indian fella became the Prime Minister of England, Indians all over the world, Hindus in particular, all over the world, rejoiced. They went and they burned the deer on number 10 Downing Street because they recognized what that represented for them. The fact that an Indian had become the Prime Minister of England, what it meant for Indians all over the world, including in India. And we must recognize that there are times when our soul, our whole being, is buoyant with some small victories like that. We must stop hiding from the fact, as I was telling my wife this morning, the Nigerians started to go to America in large numbers in the 1960s. People talk about all the other success groups. Do you all know that the Nigerians are the most successful non-white group in America? They have more Africans from Nigeria with PhDs filling the universities and hospitals quietly. Yes. In other words, why are we ashamed of talking that we are Africans? You know why? Because we don't feel there's anything to be proud of. And because of that, I brought some other stuff here that might make some of us feel a little better sometimes. Recently, they were talking about the Benin bronze statues that were made in Ife, Nigeria. They look so advanced, so finesse. They were equal to the best that Europe had at the time, that people started to speculate, well, boy, those are not Africans. The people who made them are not Africans. One thought was that they were made by Greeks about 800 BC. They said the Greeks do it, it's so good. This is why today all Africans and descendants of Africa, but particularly Africans, are saying, we want the return of the Benin bronze. The statues and heads, I bring them here, you'll take a look at after, that were made by Africans. And afterwards, you know what is the latest they are now saying, admitting? Well, it even reached the point that, you remember they used to say that they had a city that sank in the sea in Greece? They say, well, boy, that part of Africa was that city. And those people made these bronze. Can't be black people. After studying, as they say, up, right, left, etc., they have now concluded that the bronze statues that now lie in the British Museum in London and in a lot of museums in North America and the United States were made by Africans in Nigeria somewhere between the 10th century and the 15th century AD. In other words, long before Columbus came to the West Indies, these bronzes were made. And those who talk about industrial revolution like myself, just a few days ago I was giving a lecture on the role of the industrial revolution, and I keep pointing out that, look, the industrial revolution is responsible for civilization. Man moves forward through industrialization. But we must be mindful that we do not think that the industrial revolution only took place in Europe. When you look at the history of India, and this is a lesson for a lot of us right now, man could march forward and fall back and disappear. There are civilizations, Harappa, and a number of other civilizations. This is the Indian civilization that discovered pi. Remember your primary school, high school? The relationship between the circumference of a circle and the diameter are constant. 22/7, 3.142. And no matter where you are, no matter how you draw it, in the sun, in the whatever, the ratio between the circumference and the diameter is constant. For a small circle, a big circle, a very big circle, no matter what. The Indians also discovered that pi, as did the Egyptians. The Indians discovered zero. And some of us say, but what about zero? Many civilizations used to start counting from 1, 2, 3, and they don't realize that you can't start from 1, because to say 1 means the interval 1 must have passed. So you have to start from naught. Naught, like a child is 0 years old, and then it come 1 year old. The child will come 1 year old, they become 1 year after the passage of a year. It's a major concept. It seems very simple, but it is important for the development of mathematics today. In other words, there are civilizations that had their great movements, and some of them have fallen back. The Nigerian civilization, when it was making the Benin bronze, they didn't fall back on their own accord. My contention is Europe's invasion and destitution, as Rodney points out, that's why he uses the word underdeveloped. As Rasa say, you don't develop. In other words, you set up things to make a civilization go backwards. In other words, if Nigeria was ahead of Europe in the year 1000, one can only imagine where Nigeria would have been today had the Europeans not gone into Africa and underdeveloped the place. And they are still engaging in underdevelopment. So much for the question answering the indigenous people, are they entitled to reparation? Yes. Who they should give them reparation? The European powers, starting with the Spanish and end up with the Trinidad government? No. Who assume? 2, what about the Portuguese? No. Chinese? No. What about the Indians? Yes, but not for slavery, but for breach of contract and brutality. And therefore I am saying, those who say, well, sweet, why all you all put on this thing and stop worrying about this reparation? Nothing will come of it. It's too long past. I show them where history has shown us that reparation has been given hundreds of years after for a debt. And in fact, I am contending, while the Jews correctly claim possibly that what Hitler did to them was the crime of the century, in other words, the major crime of humanity in a century, that is from 1900 to the present, my contention is that the crime of the millennia is the enslavement of the African by Europe, starting from 1440. And the enslavement of the African went on up until 1962 in the case of the Arabs, and as late as 1895 in case of Cuba, and Brazil is 1888. We rejoice because we had it up to 1838. But some say that we are not yet emancipated. So the point is, these are some of the issues we are asking for reparation. Another problem that some people question is about the royal family. I remember when the present king's son went to Jamaica. The Jamaicans are always leading the fight in the Caribbean. They asked him to make a statement in order to admit the crime of the British government and the British royal family. Over the last couple of weeks with the death of the Queen, the issue became center stage. And we saw in full nakedness of the royal family that the royal family in Britain, not them alone, all the other royal families, but particularly the British royal family, because they were involved in slavery, owning ships, and there was a royal company set up where the royal family were shareholders and beneficiaries of the enslavement of Africans. And therefore, we are saying we hold them personally responsible. And that part of our struggle for emancipation must be taken to the doorstep of the British royal family as well as the British government. The question of reparation. Reparation, as I pointed out, for us is a convoluted issue, but the first government that engaged in enslavement was the Spanish. This is why the call for reparation is directed to a whole series of royal families and governments in Europe, well established. So it's not simply because the British was the last holding on to the rope, but the European royal families and their governments must be approached on the question of reparation. Now, there's one other issue I would like to deal with here, is people ask us, where are you taking the struggle for reparation? And I will say this. We are going to take the issue for reparation first and foremost to the people of the Caribbean. This discussion is part of it. It involves dealing with the questions, the concerns of our people, so that we will march together. We're not going to convince everybody. There are some of them who still don't believe that we're entitled or we shouldn't. But our first job is to take the issue of reparation to the people. This is why we have decided years ago, and we started jointly with the Anglican Church to hold talks with the people in collaboration with the Anglican Church. The first one we did on the promenade in San Fernando, and it was taped by my good friend. And a lot of other people, hundreds of other people, were able to see it long after the presentation. Then we did a second one in St. James, where we were lucky to have what is called the Bishop Emeritus, Bishop Duglin, and his brother, I remember, came to us. And that was a very important occasion because they were happy to be there, and we were glad that they were there taking part and representing the church at the highest level. But it was the night when our Prime Minister decided that, and correctly, that we were to shut down the country, shut down the airport, etc. It proved to be the right decision, one of the few right decisions that were made. And we had to give up our lecture series. At that time, we had identified about 3 or 4 other lectures that we were to give. And we are now in the process of mounting these. As I tell you, our first obligation is to take all the issues, the knotty issues, and answer people's questions, whatever they ask about reparation, to try to answer them, to justify and clarify what we mean by reparation, why, who is to give reparation, and who, why, in what form. So we are at this point, and we are going to proceed. The next point is to take the issue of reparation throughout the Caribbean. And we are not simply looking at the present CARICOM structure. We are looking at taking the issue across Anglophone, Francophone, all the other Caribbean peoples who were, in a sense, exploited by slavery. Enlarging our discussion on this day. We are present to have a widest possible discussion among CARICOM and CARICOM members and the associate members. That's the next issue, in other words, information. The second issue that we hope to do is to take our cause to the various bodies of the United Nations. In other words, we believe we have a just cause, and we are going to join international struggle for reparation. And the United Nations Forum, we are going to see as the next target for the movement. The next thing we very fortuitous is the question on the debate of the relevance of the Commonwealth of Nations. This is what we used to call the Commonwealth. And after we get independence, what we have is many countries who are not even members of the Commonwealth have now sought to join the Commonwealth. And we see an opportunity to do much more than simply the old, what you call, non-aligned movement. But we believe that this organization wasn't created to help us. But now we are, in a sense, poised to be in control. We intend to make the Commonwealth of Nations, right now West Indian is the Secretary General of it. We intend to make the issue of reparation be put on the front burner for discussion at all the meetings until they take up the issue that the Commonwealth of Nations sees the importance and relevance of the question of reparation. The next thing we want to do, when Robinson made his initial overture towards an international court. Many people protested that the court is not made for that, and that is not its jurisdiction, and etc. Robbie persisted. And I believe when we are in a fight, we cannot seek to allow other people who may even be reluctant to see the justice of our fight. We must seek opportunities to take our struggle even where they don't want us to take it. And therefore, there are some people, both in the United States and elsewhere, who are seeking to have the issue of reparation dealt with through the International Court. So these are some of the forms on which we intend to take the issue. We are not asking for handouts for the A or B or their families. What we are saying, we are engaging in this point, is that reparation must be done. The first aspect of reparation is that the persons who caused the harm must admit publicly. That's the first phase. They must admit publicly that they committed a crime. The Catholic Church, I said, the Jesuits made that declaration about 2 years ago in the States, and where they vowed to pledge to give the $3 million, and they were calling on the Catholic Church and the Pope to get up and make a statement admitting that the Catholic Church was a party to the enslavement and that they are guilty of that and they intend to make reparation. That's the first stage, to admit publicly. And the second stage, after they admit publicly, is to agree to sit and talk to the representatives of the people, the descendants of the Africans. That is, they have to talk to both the African countries, the African Union members. They must talk to the leaders of CARICOM. They must talk to the people's organizations in these regions as well as the governments. There must be discussion. Discussion where the nature and agenda of reparation will be am I getting a signal? That must be dealt with. So it's a series of things that must be done. Now, some people tell you, well, look, why are you all doing this? I feel every day I get up, I feel happier. Because sometimes people call me, I'm still in my bed, not yet up, and somebody will call me and tell me, well, you know, Cambridge just agreed that they were part of slavery and they agreed to give reparation. I could tell you, for instance, about 3 years ago, the National Trust in England had commissioned a study of all the great houses in England. And when they got a preliminary report, what they saw was that all the great houses in England were in fact owned by slave owners. Not only those that they had been given to be responsible for, but all the others. And it was then that the question of Drax, the famous Drax of Barbados, who knows, he might have been in charge of Roll and my family in Barbados because we have roots in Barbados. I don't know how many of you all have roots in Barbados, but Drax is important. Drax is important in a negative sense and in a positive sense. Drax's family was the first experimenters with sugar in the Caribbean. They started to experiment with sugar in 1630. I think Britain took over Barbados in 1620 or 1630. And Drax's family was one of the first, about a handful of families that went in there to take possession of the cutting up of Barbados. And they decided to try experimenting with sugarcane. So it is Drax who first brought sugar to the British West Indies. Who is Drax? Drax's family owned the biggest sugar estate in Jamaica. There were two brothers, one went in Barbados, one went in Jamaica. And what came out just since we talked about reparation, is that Drax is the inheritor of all that money that goes back to 1640. The money has now filtered down in the hands of one family, one man. The man is one of the richest men in England. He is the richest member in the House of Commons. But he does not want to pay tax on his holdings. So people who were agitating in the parliament challenged him on non-paying tax. And they found out that Drax did not declare that one of the things that he had been bequeathed was the estate in Barbados. But Drax was not only the originator of slavery in Athens, but one of the biggest slave owners. And that the family owns sugar estates up to today. And Drax doesn't pay taxes in England today. And that's why they were challenging him. That's why he came in the public and he was there in the British newspapers being exposed. And these things I'm saying, sometimes I wake up in the morning and I look on my phone and I see some new victory. Some new victory. Whether it be a new university in England admitting that their wealth came from slavery, or some local government agreeing and admitting that their wealth, that the whole port, all the development of the city is based on slavery. They are calling, this is why I say when I started, we are not in the business of forgiveness. We are in the business of compensation. So we cannot give them forgiveness. They have to go somewhere else to get forgiveness. What we want them is to admit their culpability of the crime of the millennia and begin a willingness to discover compensation. Tell me how I'm going. Right. So I told you all that I want you to go and download this, print your thing and look it. I want you to understand you could deal with the answers. Who should get reparation? We should get reparation. We are not asking for $1,000 for Sweet and his children. What we are saying is, the principal of the University of the West Indies made a statement some 2 years ago that we in the particularly Anglophone Caribbean have the highest incidence of amputees, a direct consequence of our diet, that we end up being the capital of the world with diabetes and amputation, blindness as a direct consequence of what we ate as slaves and what has been passed on through the genetics from parent to children. And therefore, one of the first things we want to address is when the British cut and run, they left an abominable, abysmal situation of health in the Caribbean. Diabetes, kidney failure, amputation, and blindness. And therefore, we are saying that is one thing that they have and can make compensation by contributing to the development of more modern-day health facilities in the Caribbean. Some of you are aware, for instance, that this last purge, that plague we had here, we had to stand alone. We had to stand alone. Cuba promised to give us vaccine as soon as they were finished. Cuba is the only third world country that was making vaccine. Cuba promised us. America says, see about yourself. And when people say, well, look, America should help Africa, they say, no, we have to see about ourselves and we have to stockpile. Canada bought more than 3 times the amount of vaccines that they had population. Canada, with just about 30 million people. They see about themselves. See about themselves. And I'm saying they don't love the countries of the Anglophone Caribbean. They have used us. And that is another area, the question of health, that we should call on them to pay reparation. I could talk about the education system, and what I promise you all is, as they used to say a long time, stay tuned. Because what we're going to do in each of these talks, we will deal with some of the common problems with the debate on reparation, and we attempt to introduce new topics. In closing, I would like to point out to you all that I have been at it. Yesterday, my wife told me, when you're going to take a rest, boy? I said, just now. And since I have been at it, I have prepared 6 papers that I am due to publish in this coming year. I dealt with reparation for the descendants based on the period of slavery. That was the first one. The second one, part 2, I dealt with reparation between the period 1934 to 1962 when we became independent. Some provocative ideas I raised here. Then I dealt with the third one, which is reparation for the mother country. The mother country that we call Africa, and once upon a time it used to be called Al-Kibulan. That was the name of Africa, Al-Kibulan. And I did an extensive study about what is due to the people of the African continent. That was paper number 3. Paper number 4, I did what I call From Independence to Resistance, 1962 to 1976. Disappointment, I call it. In other words, I dealt with the 1970 revolution, what it was about, and in fact, reparation that was not paid. I remember I was in the square one day when we had a meeting commemorating 1970, and I raised the issue that if we do not give land to the landless, we will suffer just like South Africa. We will have a nice pleasant period, a carnival, and the problem will go on. In other words, if we are to solve the problem, land has to be distributed to the descendants of the Africans. That was due to them in 1834 at the end of slavery. It was due to them in 1962 when we had independence. It was the basis of part of the struggle of 1970 when the government declared a state of emergency. And then I wrote paper number 5. what I call beyond reparation. Because people are asking the question, sweet, what else you want now? If you got reparation, what else you want? I did a paper on that. And something I told you all when I just started off, that's another painful one. Another painful one that worries me. It will cause a lot of things. Who knows, somebody might beat me when I go home. Shoot me. It's a paper that I wrote called Islam and the Penetration of Africa. That's another one. That is number 5. And number 6 is the one that I'm engaged in now. And I'm saying, gentlemen and ladies, in the not too distant future, I'm going to have these pages printed. I brought a clipping that some of you all have seen. It's called A Royal Gift or Stolen Gems. This was the issue that came out in the context of the death of the Queen and a big 2 weeks or 10 days celebration. And they were talking about one of the largest diamonds that came out of South Africa, that the colonial government in South Africa took that diamond and gave it to the Queen as a gift. And what we say, and a lot of other people say, is that was not a gift, not in his purview to give a gift. That was a stolen item from the land of South Africa. And that is what raises the question now, what is the Queen, the royal family, going to do about that particular diamond that was publicized throughout the world as the largest diamond that they cut up and put in the Queen, one of the Queen's things, that belonged to the African people. While I'm talking here, Africa is one of the poorest countries with hunger and starvation and no vaccine, and it's the richest country in the world. I wait on Godfrey to give me a thing here. I went and I downloaded 2 maps here. One is showing you the map of Africa with the different countries and all the wealth that existed in that country. In closing, do you all know that the plutonium and the uranium used in the Second World War to stop the Second World War that they dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from the Congo? I saw a photograph in one of the papers recently where they said that Belgium has sent back home a tooth belonging to somebody. I put it on the chat site and people are asking what it is. It's a tooth belonging to Lumumba, because Lumumba, when he was captured, he was dissolved in acid. He was not simply killed and buried like what the bandits that do people and not. They put him in acid so that nothing should remain of him. Nothing. And one of his captors extracted a tooth from his skull before they dissolved him. And that is what guilt in the face. They decided they will send it back home to the Belgium Congo for burial, hoping that that will get, remember I say, we are not in the business of forgiveness, but some people want forgiveness. They want forgiveness. We are not in the business of forgiveness. Somebody have to give them forgiveness. They have to find that elsewhere. The cruelty, the crime of the millennia, I want you all to remember that. Not the crime of the century, not a crime in 100 years, the worst crime in 1,000 years was the enslavement of the African and the transatlantic enslavement. Because we're still suffering for it. That is why I brought this. This is our literature. We too must study all of this. That's our literature. We must have it home on a shelf to show our children that that is our literature. That is our part from where we came from and where we're going to. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I promise you that my next presentation will be more substantive. I will show you what I call the case against the British government for reparation.
I want to thank Professor Sweet for a very good evening. I want to thank Professor Sweet for a very comprehensive presentation. I wouldn't say lecture, a presentation on the question of reparations. And I think if I have to describe his presentation, I would say I would summarize it using 4 W's. Who, why, what, and where. Who are entitled to reparations? The descendants of enslaved Africans. And he sought to distinguish other claims for compensation which are also worthy but which do not rise to the level of reparations for chattel slavery. So that was very, very clear. Not putting down the entitlement to others for compensation for other atrocities. Why? Because it's an outstanding issue. It's the first time I've heard the term crime of the millennia, I think most appropriately described. What reparation should entail, he further enlightened us by indicating that it is not necessarily a payment of a financial nature, but could be linked in development, in forms of development, trade relations, among other things. He also indicated where the matter should be ventilated. And he identified a number of institutions, inclusive of the United Nations, the Commonwealth of Nations, and other global bodies. And he started to make a case, I believe. He mentioned the International Court, but I believe he really wanted to say the International Criminal Court, because if you're speaking about a crime, you're talking about the International Criminal Court, and that is the court that former Prime Minister, late Prime Minister Arthur Robinson is seen as the father of. He did a lot of political work to ensure the establishment of that court. So I believe there's a lot of work to be done, and he did not also say that our next lecture series will be held at the University of the West Indies in November. But for those of you, dear audience, both live and those who are following online, the live stream, there's an opportunity for questions. And to pose your question to Professor Sweet, I wish that you come in front, you indicate what your name is, and the question, and the professor will answer the questions. So the floor is open. Any questions in the audience? After such a rich, robust lecture, I'm sure that you may have a question, or this presentation might have evoked a comment or two. Reparations is serious business. You also indicated to us it did not begin in this century. The call on the cause of reparations, or for reparations, began immediately after, as Emeritus said in his calypso, seminal calypso, the slave, immediately after the slave, the freed African, left the plantation. He had no place, he had no food, nowhere to sleep. That was a call for reparations as well. Land for the landless. So if there are no takers for, I think there's a brother coming up here. Could you come in front and identify yourself, please?
Good day. My name is Adeyemi Hines. I have some concerns which I would like you to address, please. My main concern, as we spoke about CARICON, is that we cannot speak about reparation unless we begin to educate the masses about reparations. And I see the CARICON approach as a serious shortfall in terms of they're talking to the British, they're talking to lawyers, but they're making no provision to talk and to educate the people. Would you please address that issue, please? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
The main thrust of the CARICOM supposed to be every territory is supposed to have set up a committee. And at each committee in each country supposed to have its own agenda of public education. I don't want to spend my time quarreling with them or criticizing them. I feel that we spent a lot of time in the 1970s quarreling each other. So sometimes even when I see people making mistakes, I think the best thing is to leave them alone, possibly somebody. I believe that what it means is that I will intensify what we could do. Our obligation has to be intensified. We have to take it to the schools. It's just like 1970. We have to take the issue of reparation to the young people. We cannot be satisfied to talk to little old people by themselves. No. We have to take it to the next generation. That is the first thing. The second thing is, a lot of people believe that CARICOM is a waste of time. I don't think so. I think that CARICOM started off as one set of countries, largely the Anglophone, English-speaking. But people felt that that number of English-speaking Caribbean is little more than about 7 million people. And if for economics alone, and we want to sell products, whatever, orange juice or whatever, and the reparation, then we should try and join with people who are not speaking English, the Francophone, and the other Caribbean people from Suriname. They didn't choose who colonized them. You know, some of the Africans came from Angola, they end up in Trinidad. Some come from Trinidad, they end up in Brazil. This is why we have to become imaginative and find ways, whether our governments want to do it or not, to talk to the people in Martinique and go out group on Haiti. You remember when that boy made the calypso, very important, Haiti, we are sorry. And every time you wake up in the morning and see the trouble in Haiti, I want to go back in my bed and I tell myself, Haiti, we are all guilty for not putting in, and therefore I'm saying, what has to be done is to don't worry so much who and doing nothing, but try and encourage more people, particularly young people, to understand the nature is a teaching process. We have to, some people criticize and disagree, but you have to face that is where the struggle is. The struggle is to take the issue to the young people and explain to them the nature, take pains and explain to them the nature and reason for reparation. Because every day, as I said, you pick up the papers, you find some other country or some organization. Remember in England, they went and they take a statue and throw it in the sea? And we here in Trinidad and do nothing. We know about that. But in England, Indians, Africans, and white people take a white man's statue and throw it in the sea because he was part of the slave and enslavement of black people. In other words, our cause is gaining momentum in areas where we least expect it. Our cause is right. The wind is blowing in our sail. We have to keep that. And the more we inform ourselves, for instance, I found that this book is enlightening. It's telling us so much about ourselves like a mirror. It's telling us about our experience here in the Caribbean. It's the same that the Americans experience, and therefore we have to join with them, we have to be in with them, we have to know what they're doing. And in America, for instance, a lot of universities in America are now looking for forgiveness and saying, all right, we're going to do something. So while we are not moving, our governments are not saying anything, the Jesuit church in the America coming out and saying, we agree to give reparation. 2 weeks ago, Cambridge said, we're guilty. So what we have to do is to get them now on a table. Get them on a table to agree with an agenda. What it is all you want. What you want us to do now. What is the form? Surely you're not asking. Now, by the way, let me close on this point, because a lot of people talk about time. When the British paid, just the British alone, paid the slave owners for the slaves, they paid them roughly 20 million pounds. But the British government didn't have that money. They went to a bank and tell the bank, lend the government $20 million so we could pay Jacks and the rest of them compensation for them to let go the slaves. 20 million pounds, 1834. You have any idea when they stopped paying that money? 2015. 7 years ago, the British stopped paying, finished paying that debt. So anybody tell you about that's a long thing and it finished, and the British was paying that debt up until 2015. And you know what is the cost of the debt to the British people? That is part of why they're in economic financial trouble now. You have any idea what it is they paid? The equivalent of 40 billion pounds in today's money. That is what they pay. And they had to pay that over more than 100 years to let go the Africans. They didn't give the Africans a cent. The Africans didn't get a cent, not a farthing. Who got it? The enslaver. So we are saying we were enslaved, we were damaged, we will need to be put right. And that is, if you are willing to pay 20 million pounds then, the equivalent of 40 billion pounds today, to compensate them, that is to tell you the dimension that you have to spend money to compensate the enslaved African. We have a guy, that's what we're looking for. I don't want a 50 cent, I don't nothing. I want investment in black people in the Caribbean to put them right. All what they suffered, I want compensation and try to put them right. That's it. So the fight will continue, and every morning you wake up, you will see a little victory. Every morning, a little victory. Things are better now than they were 5 years ago. The struggle for reparation is warming up.
Yes, any more questions? But before we continue, I must say that when we talk about CARICOM, French-speaking Haiti and Suriname are also part of CARICOM today. Dutch-speaking Suriname and French-speaking Haiti. So we want to embrace all of them in the fold, and not only those countries, but the wider grouping of the Association of Caribbean
Brazil.
Students. No, not Brazil.
And Brazil has over 110 million Africans. It is the largest community of Africans outside Africa. 110 million African people. We should be embracing them, because we are in Caribbean only 7 million. That is what we should be looking at.
Yeah. Any more questions, the audience? Questions or comments? I see Mr. Amy coming up.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. wish to express my deep appreciation for the delivery of this very important event. I would like to say that we speak principally about the English-speaking Caribbean, but we are at a time where changes are coming rapidly, especially in our part of the world, where development in South America, South and Central America, and the Caribbean is very, very thrilling. I think also a very important part of this evening's delivery was the issue of the Arabian enslavement of Africans. It is a feature that is not much spoken about, but it is vital to our understanding of the overall situation, as is the developments presently taking place all over Latin America. We have to look into these things more deeply. And I say thanks again to all who are responsible for this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rolini. My dear audience, both live and online, I want to thank you on behalf of the Universal Movement for the Reconstruction of Black Identity, and in particular, Professor Sweet, for such a robust lecture. Stay tuned. Omwobi will be next at the University of the West Indies in November, and we intend to continue with this crusade, this public education series, as a responsible civil society organization well into 2023 and beyond, until we get further successes on the road to success for reparative justice for the descendants of enslaved Africans. Good evening. Take care. Well done.
Thank you. This was